Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a continuation of our series of lectures, Brushing Up the Bard. This is the second lecture devoted to the Scottish play, Shakespeare's dark and brilliant Macbeth. Macbeth is tormented by the self-confrontation which the witch's prophecies provoke within him. At the end of Act 1, Scene 4, King Duncan declares that his eldest son Malcolm, proclaimed Prince of Cumberland, will be his successor. Now, what I call the anti-Duncan commentators on the play, and there are some of them, are over-eager to emphasize the fact that in medieval Scotland, the succession was not necessarily hereditary. In other words, Duncan could declare anyone worthy to be his successor. And such critics argue that by declaring Malcolm Prince of Cumberland and his successor, Duncan has withdrawn a legitimate possibility from Macbeth. Macbeth could legitimately hope, seeing that he is Duncan's valiant Macbeth, worthiest cousin there meaning relative, that he could be chosen to succeed the king. This point should not be overemphasized. Duncan insists that he will continue to promote and elevate all those who have served him loyally. In imagery relating to cosmic order and to flourishing nature, Duncan announces that honors like stars shall shine on all who are deserving. And he says to Macbeth, I have begun to plant thee, and will labour to make thee full of growing. Duncan's declaration of Malcolm as his successor does not, of course, compel Macbeth to commit evil actions. Macbeth's own lust for power is absolutely responsible for his sin. Macbeth himself shows an acute awareness of just how evil his action will be. In contrast to Duncan's imagery of radiant, ordered stars shining upon everybody, Macbeth calls for a darkened universe in which his own terrible deeds will not be visible to the horrified gaze of humanity. Stars, hide your fires, Macbeth says. Let not light see my black and deep desires. In Act 1, Scene 7, Macbeth agonizingly examines the dominant conflict within himself, and this very complex soliloquy must be read in full and examined in some detail. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. If the assassination could trammel up the consequence and catch with his surcease success, that but this blow might be the be-all and the end-all. Here, but here upon this bank and shoal of time, we jump the life to come. But in these cases, we still have judgment here, that we but teach bloody instruction, which being taught, return to plague the inventor. This even-handed justice condemns the ingredients of our poisoned chalice to our own lips. He's here in double trust. First, as I am his kinsman and his subject, strong both against the deed. Then, as his host, who should against his murderer shut the door, not bear the knife myself. Besides, this Duncan hath borne his faculties so meek, hath been so clear in his great office, that his virtues will plead like angels, trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off, and pity like a naked newborn babe striding the blast, or heaven's cherubim, horsed upon the sightless couriers of the air, shall blow the horrid deed in every eye, that tears shall drown the wind. This passage has been magnificently analysed by Andrew Dickson in his book, The Rough Guide to Shakespeare. The title of the book certainly does not do justice to its contents, and I must share with you Dixon's superb passage. Dixon writes, "The extraordinary choppy texture of these lines and their tongue-tripping quality for actors shows that Macbeth is trying to think through what seems unthinkable. His language is thick with euphemism. Assassination is a chilling coinage for murder, and this is its first appearance in the English language, and his surcease refers to Duncan's death. And Macbeth seems to be arguing, or at least hoping, that this one killing shall be the last, that it will be the be-all and the end-all. He imagines cause and effect being trammelled, bundled together into one instant. He is feverishly plotting far beyond the immediate moment into the life to come." Unquote. In other words, Macbeth's distorted imagination longs for the impossible. He longs for the guilt-free, consequence-free, both on earth and in the afterlife, evil deed. And yet he knows that such a longing is absurd. On earth, evil actions provoke vengeful retaliation. And after death, of course, God's judgment waits for all wrongdoers. It is also important to note that Macbeth constantly emphasizes the virtue of his soon-to-be victim. Duncan is described as clear in his office. Clear their meaning, of course, without corruption. He is a gracious and honourable authority figure. And this is one of the most horrifying ironies of this great text, that the man who most recognises Duncan's virtues is, of course, the regicide of the play, Macbeth himself. Now, Lady Macbeth's influence to ensure that Macbeth acts upon his black and deep desires is, of course, very significant in the play. When she reads Macbeth's letter about the more than mortal powers of the witches, she immediately ponders the nature of her beloved husband. And it is important to note that Shakespeare emphasizes the bond between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, their deep and sustaining love for each other. Macbeth addresses Lady Macbeth in the letter as his dearest, note the superlative, partner of greatness. Lady Macbeth understands that her husband longs for power, even supreme power, but she also knows that he is too morally aware to choose courses that can be considered evil without tremendous internal agony. As she unforgettably puts it, he is too full of the milk of human kindness. Kindness there does not simply mean gentle, charitable actions. It is a far more extensive meaning for Shakespeare. It means the bond that binds human beings together. It means shared humanity and empathy. It means our realization that we are all one kind, one species. And it's a very powerful image, of course, because Lady Macbeth uses the metaphor of milk, life-giving, sustaining substance. She knows that it will be extremely difficult for her to persuade her husband to perform a horrid deed which he himself acknowledges as absolutely evil. But she feels confident that when she can pour her spirits into his ear, her influence will prevail. The image of pouring words and influence into Macbeth's ear is a very disturbing one. The reader and viewer can only think of the administration of poison, and one thinks inevitably of that famous moment in Shakespeare's Hamlet, in which Claudius, of course, pours the poison into the ear of Hamlet's father as he lies asleep in his orchard. In a truly horrifying soliloquy, Lady Macbeth acknowledges the fact that for the murder to occur, an unnatural, inverted universe is required as the appropriate setting. In a witch-like invocation, she summons evil spirits to unsex her and make it possible for her to perform such a hideous deed. She calls upon evil spirits to substitute bile for the milk within her breasts and to thicken her blood so that compassionate feelings will not be able to flow along her veins and reach her heart. The Elizabethans did believe that this is how feelings flowed through the body. In short, she realizes that for a monstrous deed to be performed, the perpetrator must become a monster. She calls upon evil spirits to turn her into a being unnatural enough to perform such an unnatural deed. Link the imagery here of husband and wife. I've already quoted that wonderful line of Macbeth's, "Stars hide your fires, let not light see my black and deep desires." Lady Macbeth also calls for a darkened world. She calls for a darkness that is abnormal, thicker than the thickest smoke in hell, black enough to ensure that the murderer cannot even see the keen point, and there's a pun on keen, both sharp and eager, of the murder weapon. The Unsex Me soliloquy tells us a great deal about the psychology of Lady Macbeth. Is Lady Macbeth inhumane, evil from the outset? Surely not, because if she were, such a speech would be totally unnecessary. She would not need to call for supernatural assistance to make her evil enough to commit the deed. She would simply commit it. We see that Lady Macbeth is capable of imagination, empathy, and loving commitment. We see this in her very complete understanding of her husband's nature and the conflicts that torment him. Tragedy stems from the fact that great figures are overthrown, toppled. Macbeth is certainly a heroic warrior, a man of imagination and thought. And Lady Macbeth is by no means the caricatured virago that at times misguided actresses used to depict her as being. She is a loving wife, but tainted, of course, by excessive commitment to her husband's interests. Let's pause there. The methods Lady Macbeth uses to influence her husband are varied and immensely skillful. She uses outright lies. She insists that he has sworn to commit the deed, when all that he has actually said is that they shall speak further about the possibility. She uses emotional blackmail, stating that if he does not commit the deed, his love for her is shallow and weak. She trivializes and mocks his masculinity and his courage. She states that when he was planning to murder Duncan, he was like a drunken man, intoxicated with visions of power, and now he is like a pitiful, hungover figure, green and sickly, regretting the excesses of the night before. She also compares him mockingly to the cat in the adage, the cat in the old folk tale that wished desperately to eat fish, but was too cowardly to get its paws wet. She also uses a graphic image that everyone who has read or seen this play remembers. She says that sooner than break a promise herself, she would pluck a suckling infant from her breast and smash its brains out. It is a particularly horrifying, unnatural image, and it has huge impact upon Macbeth. Perhaps most important is the fact that she illogically insists that an inhumane deed can make one a greater human being. If Macbeth commits this atrocity, he will be, in her eyes, a superhuman, heroic figure. Macbeth understands very well that such a deed will actually make him less than human, bestial, absolutely brutal and evil. It is worth remembering at this point a wonderful comment made by the great Albert Schweitzer, who once said that the more we strive to become superhuman, the more we become inhuman. And one is only to think of Hitler's concept of Übermenschen to see just how accurate Schweitzer's chilling warning actually is. Macbeth understands what one could call the Schweitzer view. But Lady Macbeth, by power of her rhetoric and her manipulation, forces him to succumb to her temptations. Now, I've just used the word forces, and perhaps that verb is a little too strong. I'm not suggesting, of course, that Macbeth ever loses choice. Lady Macbeth is a very skillful and seductive temptress. The witches also present temptations to Macbeth, but ultimately the choice remains his own. The culpability is his, the accountability is his. He is the one who decides, finally, to kill Duncan. There are considerable influences upon him, but his freedom of choice never disappears. And that is a very important point to remember. Okay, when Macbeth advances towards Duncan's chamber to commit the fearful deed, he sees a blood-dripping dagger pointing the way to the chamber. He also acknowledges the fact that the time is very appropriate for the deed. It is midnight, the witching hour in which evil magic and evil spirits flourish. In his language, he personifies murder as withered murder, shriveled and ancient. He is very aware that it is the first crime, the crime of Cain against his brother Abel, the primal act of evil. He speaks of the wolf, a merciless beast of prey in Elizabethan eyes, as the appropriate herald of the act of murder, and he describes himself as advancing towards Duncan's chamber with, one of my favourite phrases in the text, Tarquin ravishing strides. Now that compound adjective, Tarquin ravishing, contains of course a classical allusion. And the allusion is to Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, the last king of ancient Rome. According to Roman myth, there's probably a blend of myth and history here, but we cannot be altogether sure. Tarquin raped the virtuous Lucretia while he was a guest in her home, and after the rape, she committed suicide. Some sources, however, say that Tarquin's son, Sextus, was responsible for the rape. The rape of Lucretia and her subsequent suicide are listed as causes of the outraged Roman populace's rebellion against Tarquin, the overthrow of the Tarquin dynasty, and the establishment of the Roman Republic in 509 BC. Macbeth therefore is saying that he is performing the most dastardly deed of brutal betrayal, moving towards the murder of his guest, the noble Duncan. So Macbeth's moral aversion to his own planned actions is very strongly emphasized. The hallucinatory dagger shows how disturbed, how tormented his mind actually is. And the remarkable images that I've already analyzed show how much the deed is preying upon him. However, he still chooses to commit the crime, and that is the tragedy of Macbeth. After the murder, he feels that he is alienated from all humanity and cut off from the possibility of redemption by God. He cannot pray, and he believes that his hangman's hands, as he describes them, his blood-soaked hands, will never be cleansed. In an extraordinary image, he speaks of the blood upon his hands reddening all the seas in the world and turning the multitudinous seas into one vast red ocean. The intensity of his guilt and pain makes it possible that he will reveal the guilt to everybody else, to betray what he and his wife have planned and executed. And Lady Macbeth is very afraid that this will happen. In order to prevent it from happening, she trivializes the deed, insisting that it is merely physical and will have no psychological consequences. She says that the corpse of a human being is like a sleeping human being. It is an image of the living being, and therefore one should not be afraid of it. After all, only children are afraid of images. It is the eye of childhood that fears a painted devil. She also emphasized the fact that blood is simply physical. It is simply waste, and it can be washed off very easily. A little water clears us of this deed. Lady Macbeth is determined to obliterate imagination, empathy, and guilt within her husband in order to guarantee that they are safe and secure once they have gained the power that he desires so strongly. In insisting that there will be no psychological consequences of this terrible act, Lady Macbeth is, of course, deceiving herself. It is interesting to note that she could not perform the deed herself. She comments that when she saw the sleeping Duncan, he reminded her of her father as he slept. She does not lack imaginative empathy. She is attempting to force herself to be more brutal and unnatural than she actually is. The great romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge was surely correct when he said that Lady Macbeth's insistence that she is absolutely ruthless and powerful in her commitment to evil is mere bravado, he used the term, because she does not really have such mercilessness in her nature. This would seem to be an appropriate point at which to conclude our second lecture on Macbeth. In the third lecture on this text, I shall be exploring Macbeth as king and making points about tyranny and how it is depicted in the play. I do hope that you will join me again. Thank you very much for your support.